The morning sun cast long shadows across the colony of Kepler 452c as civilians went about their daily work. Children laughed in the streets while their parents prepared for another day of building humanity's new home among the stars. The settlement had grown into a thriving place over the past 15 years. 50,000 people lived and worked here, dreaming of a future where Earth was just a distant memory and this world became their true home. Commander Nathan Price walked through the military command center, reviewing daily reports. His office overlooked the sprawling colony below, and he took a moment to appreciate the progress they had made. The trading agreement with the Krell Empire had brought prosperity to Kepler 452c. Ships arrived regularly with exotic materials and advanced technology. In exchange, humanity provided agricultural products and rare minerals. It seemed like the perfect arrangement. Peace had made everyone rich and wealth had made people complacent. Nathan Price was a man of 45 years with gray creeping into his dark hair. He had seen military action in his younger days, back when humanity was fighting over Earth's resources. He had hoped those days were behind him. He had brought his family here to start fresh, away from war and violence. His son David was 10 years old and attended the Interstellar Academy, where the brightest young minds learned science and engineering. Patricia Lawrence, the civilian administrator of the colony, sat in her office reviewing construction permits and resource allocation reports. She was a woman of 52 who had spent her entire career in colonial administration. Her daughter, Emma, was 14 years old and served as a student mentor at the academy. Patricia was proud of Emma's intelligence and kindness. She believed that her daughter would one day help lead humanity into a new age of peace and exploration. Neither Patricia nor Nathan knew that their worlds were about to end. At precisely 600 hours, the alarm screamed to life. Commander Price's head snapped up from his desk as red warning lights bathed the command center in crimson. Sensor operators shouted reports over the noise of the alarms. A massive fleet had just emerged from faster-than-light space directly above the colony. The ships were Krell vessels, but their weapon signatures indicated hostile intent. Dozens of capital ships hung in orbit, their weapons charging. "Get me a communication channel immediately," Nathan commanded, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. "Try to establish contact with the lead vessel." The communications officer struggled to comply, but before they could open a channel, the first weapons impacts shook the entire colony. Patricia Lawrence felt her office walls ripple from the force of the explosions happening miles away. She grabbed her desk for support and stared out her window in horror. Massive fireballs rose from the residential districts. Smoke began to cloud the sky. She ran from her office toward the emergency broadcast system. She needed to warn people, to get them to the underground bunkers. But as she ran through the corridors of the administrative building, more explosions rocked the structure. The Krell were not bombing military targets. They were bombing schools, hospitals, and housing complexes. Nathan Price watched the sensor display as his world burned. The Krell weapons came down like rain, and each impact erased part of the colony from existence. He ordered all military personnel to weapons stations and called for an evacuation of civilian personnel to the bunker systems that had been constructed during the colony's early days. The academy where Emma Lawrence and David Price were learning their lessons was struck by a plasma weapon at 06:12 hours. The building collapsed inward, burying hundreds of children beneath tons of rubble and fire. Emma Lawrence died instantly, her body never found among the wreckage. David Price survived the initial collapse but was crushed when a secondary structure fell minutes later. Patricia Lawrence did not yet know her daughter was dead. She fought her way through panicking crowds toward the nearest bunker entrance. Mothers clutched children as they pressed forward in desperate fear. The sky above them rained fire and death. Some people who could not fit into the bunker entrances stood on the streets, looking up at the Krell ships descending through the atmosphere. Nathan Price made it to the bunker command center, but it took him precious minutes. His hands shook as he tried to locate his son through the emergency communication system. No one could tell him anything. The systems were overwhelmed with emergency calls. He watched on the screens as more of the colony disappeared into fire and smoke. His son was gone. He knew it in his heart, but he could not accept it in his mind. The Krell landing troops came down in massive dropships, but by then most of the bombing was complete. 12,000 people were dead, including 5,000 children. The Krell soldiers, towering beings with chitinous armor and multiple limbs, moved through the rubble with methodical purpose. They seemed to be searching for survivors, hunting them in the wreckage. Commander Price organized a defense from the underground bunkers. His soldiers were outnumbered and exhausted, but they fought with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. The Krell pushed deeper into the bunker system, but the narrow corridors and confined spaces negated the aliens' numerical advantage. During a lull in the fighting, Patricia Lawrence found Nathan Price in the command center. She did not need to speak. He looked at her face and saw the same devastation that he felt. They had both lost their children to the fire above. They stood together in silence, watching the displays that showed their colony being systematically destroyed. Nathan made a decision. He activated the emergency distress beacon and sent orders to prepare the Aurora Dawn, an old terraforming vessel that had been retrofitted as an emergency evacuation ship. 8,000 survivors were loaded onto the vessel in a desperate rush. The Krell were nearly through the bunker defenses. The Aurora Dawn lifted off from the underground launch facility at 1847 hours, barely minutes before Krell soldiers reached the launch platform. As the ship broke through the atmosphere, its sensors showed the complete destruction of the colony below. Kepler 452c, home to 50,000 people, was now a tomb. In the darkness of space aboard the crippled Aurora Dawn, Commander Nathan Price and Administrator Patricia Lawrence stood together. Neither spoke about what they had lost. Instead, they looked at the gathered survivors and began making plans for the journey ahead. That was when the Krell transmission came through. Their alien voices, translated by the ship's computers into flat, emotionless human speech, delivered their message. The Krell Empire had decided that humanity represented an existential threat. All humans would be hunted and destroyed. There would be no negotiation and no mercy. Patricia Lawrence listened to the message and felt something break inside her. She had believed in peace. She had built her entire life around the dream that different species could live together in harmony. In a single day, the Krell had murdered that dream and destroyed everything she loved. Nathan Price listened to the same message and felt rage consuming him like a fire. His son was dead. His colony was destroyed, and now they were hunted. He made a silent promise to David and to every other child lost at Kepler 452c. He swore that he would find a way to make the Krell pay for what they had done. The Aurora Dawn traveled through space for nearly 6 months, limping along on damaged engines and failing life support systems. The ship had been designed to terraform planets, not to transport refugees across the galaxy. Every day brought new problems and new deaths. People died from infected wounds, from diseases that spread in the crowded conditions, and from the simple weight of despair. Commander Nathan Price and Administrator Patricia Lawrence worked together to keep order and hope alive among the survivors. They established a council of leaders who made decisions about resource distribution and daily operations. They created schedules so that people could maintain some sense of normalcy and routine. They organized memorial services for those they had lost. The memorial services were the hardest part. Every evening, survivors would gather in the Aurora Dawn's largest compartment and speak the names of the dead. Families would stand together and remember the people who would never reach the safety of Earth or any other human world. Nathan Price attended every service, and each time he heard another child's name spoken, he felt the anger inside him grow deeper and colder. Patricia Lawrence spent her days writing reports and sending distress signals into the vast darkness of space. She documented every detail of the massacre on Kepler 452c. She recorded testimony from survivors who had witnessed the bombing. She compiled lists of the dead, including her daughter Emma. She wanted the entire human race to know exactly what the Krell had done. She wanted the universe to remember. When the Aurora Dawn finally made contact with human space, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Military ships came out to escort them to safety. News networks broadcast images of the refugee ship and the survivors it carried. The story of the massacre spread across every human world and colony. Humanity learned that the Krell, whom they had believed to be peaceful trading partners, were actually ruthless killers willing to commit genocide. The United Nations Space Command called an emergency session. Representatives from every human colony and from Earth itself gathered to discuss the crisis. Some demanded immediate military retaliation against the Krell. Others wanted to understand why the attack had happened. Still others feared that any hostile action would only bring more death and destruction to humanity. General Marcus Williams sat in his command office and reviewed the reports from Kepler 452c. He was a man of 60 years old. with a weathered face that showed every year of his military service. He had fought in wars on Earth, on Mars, and in the asteroid colonies. He had seen the worst that humanity could do to itself. Now he was studying what an alien species could do to humanity. General Williams listened to the testimony of Commander Nathan Price before the United Nations Assembly. Price spoke in a quiet, steady voice, describing the destruction of his colony and the slaughter of innocents. When he finished speaking, there was silence in the chamber. Even those who advocated for peace could not argue against the facts. Patricia Lawrence followed Nathan Price to the podium. She spoke about her daughter Emma and about all the other children who had died in the attack. She spoke with such raw emotion that several delegates wept openly. She showed the documentation she had compiled, the lists of names, the records of families destroyed in a single day. General Williams made his recommendation to the United Nations Security Council. He proposed a comprehensive military response. Humanity would build a new fleet, and they would hunt down the Krell fleets that were moving toward other human colonies. They would defend themselves and protect their people, but he also warned that human military forces were currently no match for the Krell Empire. In a direct conflict, humanity would likely be defeated. This truth shook the assembly. Humanity had always believed itself to be superior in intelligence and adaptability. The idea that they were outmatched militarily was difficult to accept. Some delegates began to suggest surrender and negotiation. Perhaps they could appease the Krell. Perhaps they could offer something to stop the attacks. General Williams stood before the assembly and rejected this idea completely. He said that appeasement would only result in the complete extinction of the human race. The Krell had already decided that humans must be destroyed. There was no negotiation possible with beings who wanted genocide. In his private chambers, General Williams met with a small group of military and scientific advisors. Among them was Captain Margaret Foster, the head of military intelligence operations. Margaret Foster was a woman of 40 years who had spent her entire career gathering information about alien species and their capabilities. "I need you to find me the Krell homeworld," Williams told her, "and I need you to find me their weakness." Margaret Foster and her team worked around the clock, analyzing every piece of data they had gathered about the Krell over the years. They studied Krell biology, their weapons systems, their communication patterns, and their military doctrine. Slowly, they began to see patterns. The Krell seemed to avoid certain areas of space. They seemed to fear certain radiation patterns. And in their scientific publications, they made references to ancient parasitic organisms that they had engineered and controlled. After weeks of investigation, Margaret Foster brought her findings to General Williams. She had identified the Krell homeworld's location. More importantly, she had found something extraordinary. The Krell had engineered a parasitic organism thousands of years ago, modifying it to be completely harmless to Krell biology while being deadly to their enemies. Over the centuries, the Krell had refined this organism and taught their bodies to carry it without harm. "What if," General Williams said slowly, "we could reverse that modification? What if we could make that organism deadly to the Krell?" Margaret Foster understood immediately what he was suggesting. It would be genocide on a scale that humanity had never contemplated. The extinction of an entire species. She wanted to refuse, but she thought about the children of Kepler 452c. She thought about the 5,000 young lives that the Krell had deliberately destroyed. "It might be possible," she said quietly. "We would need access to Krell genetic material and a team of the best biologists on Earth. But yes, I think we could do it." General Williams made his decision. He brought the proposal to President Richard Hayes of the United Nations Space Command. Hayes listened carefully to every detail. He asked questions about the moral implications and the strategic possibilities. When Williams finished, Hayes sat in silence for a long time. "How long would it take?" Hayes finally asked. 3 months to modify the organism," Williams replied. "Another month to create a delivery system and train a team to deploy it. We would also need to construct a vessel that could reach the Krell homeworld without being detected." President Hayes approved the project immediately. He allocated unlimited resources and authorized the highest level of secrecy. The United Nations began construction of a new military vessel, the Vengeance's Torch. It was designed to be fast, heavily armored, and equipped with the most advanced stealth technology that humanity had ever created. Commander Nathan Price volunteered for the mission before he was even asked. When General Williams approached him with an offer to lead the military team that would deploy the biological weapon, Price accepted without hesitation. Patricia Lawrence also volunteered. She told General Williams that she wanted to look the Krell homeworld in the eye and watch them die. Williams understood her motivation. He accepted her as part of the team. As the final preparations began, Nathan Price and Patricia Lawrence stood together in the construction facility where the Vengeance's torch was taking shape. The ship was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a perfect instrument of vengeance and destruction. "We're going to kill an entire species," Patricia said quietly. "Yes," Nathan Price replied. "We are, and I don't feel a single moment of regret about it." Patricia Lawrence said nothing. She did not feel regret either. She felt only the cold weight of justice and the burning desire for revenge. The children of Kepler 452c would be avenged. Even if it meant the complete extinction of the Krell, the price would be worth paying. The Vengeance's torch launched from Earth orbit on a cold morning in late winter. The ship was smaller than most military vessels but packed with the most advanced technology humanity possessed. Its captain was Marcus Chen, a veteran officer who had commanded ships in conflicts across the solar system. His crew consisted of 300 of humanity's finest soldiers, scientists, and pilots. Among them were Commander Nathan Price and Administrator Patricia Lawrence. The journey to Krell space would take months, even using the fastest routes through known space. The crew had to travel through regions of space that were only partially mapped. They had to rely on ancient navigation data from explorers who had ventured beyond the established trade routes. Every day brought new dangers and new problems. On the third week of the journey, one of the ship's scientists, a man named Kevin Barrett, suffered a complete psychological breakdown. He had been working on the biological weapon project, helping to refine the modified parasite that would carry death to the Krell homeworld. One night, he stood on the observation deck and watched the stars passing by. He began to weep and could not stop. When the medical officer, Dr. Susan Mills, tried to help him, Kevin began to speak about the weight of his actions. He said that he could not carry the burden of knowing that he was creating a weapon that would destroy billions of lives. He said that the Krell were living beings and that no matter what they had done, genocide was not justified. Patricia Lawrence heard about Kevin's breakdown and came to speak with him in the medical bay. She sat beside his bed and looked at him for a long time before speaking. She told him that her daughter Emma was dead because of the Krell. She told him that 5,000 children had been slaughtered for no reason other than the fact that they were human. She asked him whether the Krell had hesitated before dropping bombs on schools and hospitals. Kevin Barrett listened to her words and wept harder. Patricia reached out and touched his hand. She told him that she understood his guilt, but that guilt was a luxury they could not afford. They had to finish what they had started, or humanity would be wiped out. She left him alone with that thought. As the weeks passed, the psychological strain on the crew began to show. People became irritable and paranoid. Arguments broke out over small things. Some crew members began to question whether they were doing the right thing. Others seemed to embrace the idea of genocide with an eagerness that disturbed those around them. Commander Nathan Price noticed the deteriorating morale and spoke to Captain Chen about the problem. Chen decided to institute mandatory counseling sessions and increased recreational activities. He wanted his crew to remember that they were still human, not just machines of war. The Vengeance's torch passed through an ancient wormhole that the exploration teams had discovered years before. The passage through the wormhole was rough and dangerous. The ship's hull groaned and creaked as they traveled through the distorted space. Several sections suffered minor damage. One engineer, a young man named Brian Cooper, was killed when a power conduit exploded in his workstation. Patricia Lawrence attended Brian's memorial service. She stood with the other crew members and listened as Captain Chen read his name. She thought about how many more names would be added to the list of the dead before this mission was complete. She thought about all the names that would be carved into memorials, both human and Krell. As the ship approached Krell space, the crew's anxiety increased. They ran constant scans looking for any sign of Krell military activity. Every alert caused people to jump. Everyone slept less and worked more. The weight of the mission hung over them like a storm cloud. 3 months into the journey, a Krell patrol ship was spotted by the Vengeance's torch's sensors. Captain Chen ordered the ship to full stealth mode and altered their course to avoid detection. For 3 tense hours, the Krell vessel remained in their vicinity. The crew held its breath, waiting to see if they had been discovered. Finally, the Krell ship moved away and disappeared from sensor range. That night, Patricia Lawrence found Nathan Price in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars. She stood beside him in silence for a long time. Nathan spoke first. "I keep thinking about David," he said quietly. "I wonder what he was thinking when the building came down. I wonder if he was afraid. I wonder if he called out for me." Patricia reached over and gripped his shoulder. She understood his pain perfectly. She had the same thoughts about Emma every single day. "It will be over soon," Patricia said, "and they will pay for what they did." "Will they?" Nathan asked. "Will payment for what happened bring our children back? Will it heal what the Krell broke inside us?" Patricia had no answer to his question. She believed that revenge was the only justice available to them, but she also knew that no amount of vengeance would restore what had been lost. 2 weeks later, the Vengeance's torch encountered a series of gravitational anomalies that required careful navigation. The ship's pilot, Lieutenant Henry Walsh, worked for hours to plot a safe course through the dangerous space. He managed to guide them through without serious damage, but the effort exhausted him. He collapsed at his station and had to be carried to the medical bay. Dr. Susan Mills discovered that Henry had suffered a severe heart attack. He died despite her best efforts to save him. He was 42 years old and had served in the military for over 20 years. He left behind a wife and 2 children on Earth. Captain Chen held a brief service for Henry. He did not give a long speech. He simply said that Henry had died in service to humanity, and that they would carry his memory forward. The crew continued on their journey with renewed determination. They had lost 3 team members already, and the mission was only half complete. No one talked about it openly, but everyone was thinking the same thing. More of them would die before they reached their destination. That was simply the cost of what they were doing. As the Vengeance's torch approached Krell space, Margaret Foster and her team began to prepare the biological weapon for deployment. The modified parasite had been carefully cultivated and contained in specialized tanks. The quantum broadcast array had been calibrated and tested. Everything was ready. Margaret Foster sat in the laboratory and reviewed all the technical specifications one final time. Everything was correct. When they activated the broadcast array, the signal would spread across all Krell-controlled space simultaneously. The parasites would begin to activate in Krell bodies throughout the Empire. The death would be swift and comprehensive. There would be no survivors and no possibility of reversing what they had set in motion. She thought about the children of Kepler 452c. She thought about Emma, Lawrence, and David Price, and all the others whose names had been read at memorial services. She thought about 5,000 young voices that would never speak again, never laugh again, never grow up and have families of their own. Margaret Foster opened a secure communication channel to Captain Chen and reported that the weapon was ready for deployment. Chen acknowledged her report and began to plot their final approach to the Krell homeworld. In the observation deck, Commander Nathan Price and Administrator Patricia Lawrence stood together once more. They could see the Krell homeworld on the sensors now, a blue and green world orbiting a yellow star. Billions of Krell lived on that world, billions of lives that were about to be ended by human hands. Patricia reached down and squeezed Nathan's hand. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The die had been cast months ago on Earth. Now it was simply a matter of following the path to its end. The Vengeance's torch moved into position. The crew made final preparations, and somewhere deep inside the ship, the modified parasite waited in its containment tanks, ready to be released upon the universe. The Vengeance's torch moved silently through the darkness, its stealth systems working perfectly to keep the ship invisible to all Krell sensors. Captain Marcus Chen stood on the bridge and watched the Krell homeworld grow larger on the view screen. The world was beautiful in a way that made his chest hurt. It had oceans and continents and swirling white clouds. It looked almost like Earth. Patricia Lawrence stood beside him, her face pale and drawn. She had barely slept in the last 72 hours. She had spent her time working with Margaret Foster in the laboratory, making final preparations to the biological weapon. Every calculation checked out perfectly. The modified parasite would be activated by a quantum signal broadcast across all Krell space simultaneously. There would be no escape and no defense. Commander Nathan Price entered the bridge and walked directly to Patricia. He placed a hand on her shoulder and looked at her face carefully. He was worried about her. He was worried about all of them. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Whatever happened next, humanity would never be the same. "The crew is ready," Nathan said quietly. "They're waiting for your order." Patricia took a deep breath and nodded. She had volunteered to be the one to activate the broadcast array. She wanted to be the one to press the button that would end the Krell species. General Marcus Williams had accepted her request without argument. He understood that she needed to do this herself. Captain Chen ordered the Vengeance's torch to move into its final position. The ship descended through the upper atmosphere of the Krell homeworld, remaining hidden by the most advanced stealth technology that humanity possessed. Below them, vast cities stretched across continents. Billions of Krell went about their daily lives, completely unaware of the death that hung above them. In the laboratory, Margaret Foster made the final adjustments to the quantum broadcast array. The device was enormous, taking up nearly half of the lab's available space. Every wire and circuit had been triple-checked. Every component had been tested and retested. The array was ready to function exactly as designed. Margaret thought about her own family back on Earth. She had a husband and 2 children whom she had left behind for this mission. She wondered if she would ever see them again. She wondered what they would think when they learned what she had done. Would they be proud of her for saving humanity, or would they be ashamed of her for committing genocide? Dr. Susan Mills worked with Margaret in the laboratory. She had been assigned to monitor the biological weapon and ensure that it remained stable and viable for deployment. As a doctor, Susan had taken an oath to preserve life and do no harm. Working on this project had violated everything she believed in. But she had continued anyway, telling herself that saving humanity justified the means. Nathan Price walked through the corridors of the ship, checking on different departments and talking with crew members. Everyone was tense but focused. The soldiers had cleaned their weapons and checked their equipment multiple times. The pilots had reviewed escape routes and contingency plans. The scientists had verified their calculations one last time. Everyone understood that they were about to cross a line that separated them forever from what they used to be. A young ensign named Rachel Harris asked Nathan a question that he had been dreading. She asked if he truly believed that killing billions of Krell was justified by what they had done to Kepler 452c. She asked if revenge was worth the price of their own humanity. Nathan looked at the young woman and saw fear in her eyes. He saw doubt and moral confusion. He understood exactly what she was feeling because he felt the same things himself. "I don't know," Nathan said honestly. "I know that the Krell killed our children. I know that they would have destroyed every human colony and every human settlement across the galaxy. I know that this is the only way to stop them. As for whether it's justified, I think we'll be asking ourselves that question for the rest of our lives. But we've come too far to turn back now." Rachel nodded slowly and returned to her duties. Nathan continued his walk through the ship, but her question remained with him. He wondered if there had been another way. He wondered if they had exhausted every possibility for peace and negotiation. He wondered if future generations of humans would remember this moment as a necessary act of survival, or as a war crime that humanity could never overcome. Captain Chen received a report that the Vengeance's torch had reached its optimal position. The quantum broadcast array had a clear line to every part of the Krell Empire and beyond. Everything was ready. All they had to do was activate the system. Patricia Lawrence was escorted to the array control station by a security officer. The station was small and contained only a few controls and a large red button that would activate the broadcast. Patricia stood before it and looked at the button for a long time. She thought about Emma. She thought about her daughter's laugh and her brightness and her dreams of exploring the stars. She thought about how the Krell had stolen all of that away in a single moment. She pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the quantum broadcast array hummed to life. Power surged through every circuit and wire. The array projected a signal outward at the speed of light, spreading through Krell space like a wave. Within seconds, the signal had reached every Krell colony, every Krell ship, and every Krell military installation. In the cells of billions of Krell, the modified parasites suddenly activated. The organisms that had been engineered to be harmless suddenly became deadly. They began to reproduce rapidly, flooding through Krell bodies and destroying their neural tissue. The transformation was swift and agonizing. On the Krell homeworld, the first deaths began to occur within minutes. Krell fell in the streets, convulsing and screaming. In hospitals, doctors tried desperately to save their patients but could do nothing. The parasite was too efficient and too deadly. In military installations, commanders watched their armies collapse as soldiers died at their posts. The Krell tried to respond. They attempted to launch counterattacks against human space, but their military command structure was crumbling as their commanders died. Ships that tried to launch crashed before they could reach orbit. Weapons that tried to fire malfunctioned as their operators collapsed. On the bridge of the Vengeance's torch, the crew watched as the Krell civilization fell apart in real time. Sensor readings showed the death spreading across the Krell Empire like a fire-consuming dry wood. Cities went dark as their power systems failed. Communication networks fell silent as operators died. Military fleets stopped responding to commands. Within hours, billions of Krell were dead. Within a day, nearly the entire Krell species had been wiped from existence. Only a handful of isolated populations in remote regions survived. But even they were doomed. The parasite would find them eventually. The Krell species was extinct. Patricia Lawrence stood at the broadcast array control station and felt nothing. She had expected to feel triumph or satisfaction or relief. She expected to feel something like justice. Instead, she felt only emptiness and a terrible, aching void where her humanity used to be. Captain Chen received reports that Krell battle fleets were moving toward human space, but their movements were chaotic and uncoordinated. Without central command, the surviving Krell fleets were attacking each other as much as they were attacking human ships. The few human military vessels that encountered them easily defeated the confused and desperate Krell forces. General Marcus Williams received the news on Earth. The mission was complete. The Krell species had been effectively destroyed. Humanity was safe. Billions of humans would live because of what had been done today. But in the achievement of that safety, humanity had destroyed an entire, intelligent species and committed genocide on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Nathan Price and Patricia Lawrence stood together in the observation deck of the Vengeance's torch and looked down at the Krell homeworld. The world was still beautiful, but it was now a tomb containing billions of dead. They had won their victory, but at a cost that could never be calculated or justified. "We've done it," Patricia said quietly. "We've saved humanity." "Yes," Nathan replied, "we have. But I'm not sure if we've saved ourselves." The Vengeance's torch began its journey back toward human space. The crew worked in silence, going through the motions of their duties but feeling like ghosts moving through a dream. They had accomplished their mission. They had avenged the children of Kepler 452c. They had destroyed the Krell, but no one aboard. The ship could shake the feeling that they had lost something, in the process that was far more valuable than what they had gained. The Vengeance's torch entered human space like a ghost ship returning from the dead. News of the successful mission had already spread across every human colony and settlement. The ship was met with celebrations and parades. Crowds gathered in cities to welcome the heroes who had saved humanity from extinction. But the crew of the Vengeance's torch did not feel like heroes. They felt like murderers who had committed the greatest crime in human history. Captain Marcus Chen brought the ship to dock at the main military space station orbiting Earth. As the crew began to disembark, they were greeted by military officials and political leaders. General Marcus Williams himself was there to welcome them home. He shook hands with Nathan Price and Patricia Lawrence and thanked them for their sacrifice and service. But even as he offered his thanks, General Williams could see the emptiness in their eyes. He understood what they had experienced and what they had become. They were no longer the same people who had left Earth months ago. They had crossed a line that separated the living from the dead, the human from the monster. The weight of genocide would follow them for the rest of their lives. The United Nations organized a hearing to examine the mission and its success. Representatives from every human government and colony came to listen to the testimony of the crew. Some wanted to celebrate the destruction of the Krell. Others wanted to understand the details of what had happened. Still others wanted to assign blame for what they saw as a war crime. Commander Nathan Price was called to testify first. He sat before the assembly and described the mission in detail. He talked about the journey through space, the psychological strain on the crew, and the final moments before Patricia activated the broadcast array. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, like a machine reciting facts rather than a human describing events. When asked if he believed the genocide was justified, Nathan paused for a long time before answering. He said that the Krell had murdered 50,000 humans, including thousands of children. He said that they had declared their intention to exterminate all of humanity. He said that the Vengeance's torch had prevented human extinction. But he also said that none of those facts changed the reality of what they had done. They had destroyed an entire species. They had committed genocide. And no matter how much it might have been necessary, that fact could never be undone or justified. Patricia Lawrence testified after Nathan. She brought with her a list of the names of all the children who had died at Kepler 452c. She read every name aloud in front of the assembly. It took nearly an hour to read all 5,000 names. When she finished, the chamber was completely silent. Patricia spoke about her daughter Emma and about the other families who had lost everything. She spoke about the rage and despair that had driven her to volunteer for the mission. She spoke about the moment when she pressed the button that destroyed billions of lives. And then she asked the assembly a question that none of them could answer. She asked whether the death of billions of Krell could bring back even one of the children who had been murdered at Kepler 452c. The hearing lasted for 3 days. Some delegates called for the prosecution of the Vengeance's torch crew as war criminals. Others demanded monuments and celebrations in their honor. The debate was fierce and passionate, but ultimately, the United Nations decided that the mission had been necessary and that no charges would be filed against the crew. However, the decision did not bring peace to the members of the crew. They knew what they had done. They knew that they had destroyed an entire intelligent species. They knew that billions of sentient beings had suffered and died because of their actions. No political verdict could erase that knowledge or absolve them of responsibility. General Marcus Williams met with Nathan Price and Patricia Lawrence in his private office. He offered them positions in the new government that was being formed to govern the newly conquered Krell territories. He told them that humanity now had access to vast new resources and endless opportunities for expansion. He suggested that they could use their experience and leadership to help build a new human civilization across the stars. Nathan and Patricia both declined. They asked for discharge from military service. They wanted to leave Earth and disappear into obscurity. They wanted to be left alone with their thoughts and their memories and their guilt. General Williams accepted their requests without argument. He understood that some burdens were too heavy to bear, and that some scars never truly healed. Nathan Price took a transport ship to one of the outer settlements, a small colony on the edge of human space. He rented a small house and spent his days walking through forests and sitting by the ocean. He did not speak to other people unless it was absolutely necessary. He did not watch the news or listen to reports about human expansion into Krell space. He tried to live a quiet life, but he could not escape the ghosts of what he had done. Patricia Lawrence traveled to a different settlement, a mountain colony where the air was thin and the nights were long and dark. She spent her time writing. She wrote about the massacre at Kepler 452c. She wrote about the journey of the Vengeance's torch. She wrote about the moment she activated the broadcast array. She wrote hundreds of pages trying to make sense of what she had experienced and what she had become. Months after the mission, Patricia traveled to a memorial site that had been constructed on one of the restored Krell worlds. The memorial had been built to honor both the human and Krell dead. The United Nations had decided that the genocide should be remembered and studied, so that future generations would understand the terrible cost of war and revenge. Patricia stood in the memorial chamber and looked at the walls covered with names. The human dead were carved on one side, the Krell dead on the other side. There were no differences between them in death. They were all names. They were all lives that had been ended by the choices of others. They were all victims of a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. She found a private place in the memorial and knelt before a plaque bearing the names of all the children who had died at Kepler 452c. She whispered an apology to her daughter, Emma. She whispered an apology to all the human children who had died, and she whispered an apology to all the Krell who had been destroyed because of human revenge. Back on Earth, General Marcus Williams reviewed reports of human expansion into former Krell territory. New colonies were being established at a rapid pace. Resources were being harvested and transported back to human worlds. The economy was booming. Humanity was thriving. The future looked bright and prosperous. But in his private moments, Williams thought about the cost of that prosperity. He thought about the billions of Krell who had been wiped out. He thought about the crews of the Vengeance's torch who were now broken and scattered. He thought about what kind of species humanity was becoming. He made a decision to establish a historical archive dedicated to the Krell. He wanted future generations of humans to understand who the Krell had been before they were destroyed. He wanted humans to know their history and their culture and their achievements. He did not want them to be forgotten. In his private chambers, Nathan Price received a communication from Patricia Lawrence. She asked him to meet her at the memorial site. Nathan agreed, and weeks later he traveled to the Krell homeworld for the first time since the Vengeance's torch had completed its mission. He found Patricia standing in the memorial chamber, looking at the walls covered with names. They stood together in silence for a long time. Neither knew what to say to the other. They had shared an experience that no one else could truly understand. They had seen each other at their absolute worst and their absolute best. They had discovered the terrible things that humans were capable of doing. Finally, Patricia spoke. She said that she had been thinking about whether they had made the right decision. She said that she had thought about it every single day since they activated the broadcast array. She said that she still did not have an answer. Nathan nodded slowly. He said that he had been thinking the same thing. He said that he did not think there was a right answer. There were only choices, and each choice had consequences. They had made a choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Patricia reached out and took Nathan's hand. They stood together before the memorial, looking at the names of the dead. They thought about the children of Kepler 452c. They thought about the billions of Krell who had been destroyed. They thought about humanity and what it had become. The story ended with no clear resolution, no moment of redemption or forgiveness. Nathan Price and Patricia Lawrence were alive and safe, but they would never be free from the weight of what they had done. Humanity had survived, but it had paid a price far greater than anyone had anticipated. The question of whether survival obtained through genocide could ever be called a victory would remain unanswered. A question that every generation of humans would have to ask themselves. In the darkness of space, on a world that had once been home to billions of Krell, the memorial stood as a reminder of humanity's capacity for both compassion and cruelty. It stood as a warning to future generations about the terrible cost of revenge. And it stood as proof that even the greatest victories could feel like the greatest defeats if the price was paid in the extinction. 20 years had passed since the Vengeance's torch completed its mission and returned to human space. 2 decades of human expansion and growth across what had once been the Krell Empire. 2 decades of building new cities and establishing new colonies on worlds that had belonged to an alien civilization that no longer existed. Commander Nathan Price sat alone in his small house on the mountain colony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. His hair had turned almost completely gray. Lines covered his face like a map of the suffering he had endured. He was 70 years old now, and his body was beginning to fail him. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps too sharp because he remembered every detail of the mission with perfect clarity. He received a visitor one evening. It was a young woman named Claire, who was a journalist and documentary filmmaker. She had made a career studying the Krell extinction event and its impact on human civilization. She wanted to interview Nathan about his experiences on the Vengeance's torch. Nathan was reluctant to speak. He had spent the last 2 decades avoiding publicity and refusing interviews. But Claire was persistent, and something in her approach was different from other journalists who had tried to contact him. She did not want to celebrate what he had done. She wanted to understand it. Nathan agreed to speak with her, but only if she would promise to tell the complete truth, not just the parts that made humanity look heroic or justified. Claire set up her recording equipment and asked Nathan to tell her about the mission from the beginning. Nathan spoke for hours, describing every detail of the journey to Krell space and the moment Patricia Lawrence activated the broadcast array. He talked about the crew members who had died along the way. He talked about the psychological toll of carrying the weight of genocide. When Claire asked him if he regretted the mission, Nathan was silent for a long time. He said that he had asked himself that question thousands of times, and he still did not have a clear answer. He said that the Krell had murdered his son and 50,000 other humans. He said that they would have destroyed every human colony if given the chance. But he also said that none of those facts justified what they had done. He said that genocide was genocide, no matter the reason. Claire asked him what humanity had learned from the extinction of the Krell. She asked if human civilization had become better or worse in the decades since. Nathan thought carefully about his answer. He said that humanity had become more prosperous and more powerful. He said that human territories now stretched across half the galaxy. He said that billions of humans were living better lives because of the resources that had once belonged to the Krell. But he also said that something fundamental had changed inside human society. He said that humans now knew what they were capable of doing. They knew that they could destroy an entire intelligent species if they felt threatened. And that knowledge had changed something in the human soul. Patricia Lawrence lived in a small apartment in the city of New Haven, a major human settlement on one of the Krell worlds that had been renamed and colonized by humans. She spent her days working in an archive that preserved information about Krell history and culture. She had become an expert on the Krell and their civilization, dedicating her life to ensuring that they would not be forgotten. Patricia was 68 years old now. She had never remarried after her husband had died 15 years ago. She had devoted herself entirely to her work and to the memory of those who had been lost both at Kepler 4532c and in the Krell extinction event. She received visitors from all over human space. Students came to learn about the Krell. Scholars came to access the archives. Families came to understand the history that had shaped their lives. Patricia welcomed all of them and shared what she had learned about the civilization that humanity had destroyed. One day, a young man came to the archive looking for information about his family history. His name was Jacob, and he was 25 years old. He had been born on one of the colonies that existed in what had once been Krell space. He asked Patricia if she could help him understand what the Krell had been like before they were destroyed. Patricia spent several hours with Jacob, showing him records and artifacts and information about Krell culture and society. She explained that the Krell had been a civilization with art and music and philosophy. They had had families and loved ones. They had built cities and created great works of engineering. They had dreams and hopes and fears. Jacob listened carefully and asked many questions. At the end of their conversation, he asked Patricia a question that surprised her. He asked if she believed that her daughter Emma would have approved of what she had done to save humanity. Patricia was quiet for a long time. She said that she did not know. She said that Emma had been a kind and compassionate person. She said that Emma would have hated the idea of genocide. But she also said that Emma would have wanted humanity to survive. She said that she would never know if Emma would have understood the choice she had made. General Marcus Williams had retired from military service 10 years ago. He was now 80 years old and living in a private estate on Earth. He had written several books about military strategy and the Krell extinction event. He had become something of a philosopher in his later years, reflecting on the decisions that had shaped human history. Williams received a visit from President Richard Hayes, the son of the president who had authorized the original mission. Hayes asked General Williams if he had any regrets about the decisions that had been made. Williams looked out the window at the gardens surrounding his home. He said that he had thought about the decision to deploy the biological weapon thousands of times. He said that he believed it had been necessary. He said that if they had not done it, humanity would have been destroyed. But he also said that he would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. He said that history would judge what they had done. Some generations would see it as a necessary act of survival. Other generations would see it as a terrible crime. But regardless of how history judged them, they had changed the course of civilization in a way that could never be undone. In the memorial site on the former Krell homeworld, thousands of visitors came every year to remember both the human and Krell dead. The memorial had become one of the most important historical sites in human civilization. Students were required to visit it as part of their education. It was a place where humanity confronted the truth about what it had done. A new section of the memorial had been added in recent years. This section contained the names of all the Krell who had been killed in the extinction event. It was impossible to list every Krell death, so the memorial simply contained a plaque that read, "To the billions of Krell who died so that humanity could survive. May we never forget what we have done." 20 years after the mission, Nathan Price and Patricia Lawrence met at the memorial for the first time in over a decade. They stood together in silence, looking at the names carved into the stone. They were both old now, and they could both feel the weight of years and suffering pressing down on them. Patricia spoke first. She said that she had been thinking about a question that a student had asked her. The student had asked whether the Krell would have been more merciful if they had won the war against humanity. Patricia said that she had spent years trying to answer that question, and she had realized that it did not matter. What mattered was what humanity had chosen to do, not what the Krell might have done. Nathan nodded slowly. He said that he had been thinking about the future. He said that humanity would continue to expand and prosper across the galaxy. He said that new generations would be born who would have no memory of the Krell. He said that they would ask their elders why humanity had committed genocide, and the elders would have to explain about Kepler 452c and the slaughter of the children. They stood together in the memorial chamber as the sun set outside. They thought about everything that had happened in the past 20 years. They thought about how humanity had changed and how the weight of genocide had shaped every aspect of human civilization. As they left the memorial, Patricia touched the wall carved with Krell names. She whispered a prayer for the dead, both human and Krell. She asked for forgiveness, though she was not sure who she was asking or whether forgiveness was even possible. Nathan walked beside her into the darkness. They did not speak because there were no words left to say. They had lived through the greatest tragedy in human history. They had committed the greatest crime in human history, and they would carry that burden for whatever time they had left in their lives. The story of humanity and the Krell would continue to be told for generations to come. It would be told in classrooms and in history books. It would be studied by philosophers and ethicists. It would be debated by politicians and military leaders. But the simple truth remained the same. Humans had destroyed an entire intelligent species in order to survive, and that truth would haunt human civilization forever.